In the first days of November 1942, the German army believed it was winning again. Across the frozen steppe west of Stalingrad, long columns of tanks and trucks moved through the darkness. Engines growled in the cold. Exhaust smoke drifted low across the ground. Officers stood in open turrets with maps pressed against their gloves. Radio operators sent calm reports to headquarters. After months of brutal fighting, many German commanders were convinced that the Soviet Union was almost finished. Every sign seemed to support that belief. Soviet units were pulling back. Villages were being abandoned. Roads were left open. Bridges were not blown. Reconnaissance pilots saw what looked like confusion behind Soviet lines. To German commanders, this was familiar. They had seen it in Poland, in France, and in the first months of the invasion of the Soviet Union. The enemy was retreating. The breakthrough was coming. But the men directing the Red Army were thinking several moves ahead. They had learned something essential about German power. German tanks were deadly. Their crews were experienced. Their commanders reacted quickly. Their radios allowed fast coordination. When a panzer division struck with full strength, it could tear open a front in a matter of hours. Yet these powerful machines depended on one fragile thing: fuel. Without fuel, a tank became a steel bunker. Its gun still existed. Its armor still looked frightening. But it could not move, maneuver, retreat, or attack. It was trapped wherever it stood. The Soviet High Command understood that destroying tanks was not the only way to defeat them. You could let them drive deeper. You could make them believe they were winning. You could force them to burn every last liter. And then, at the exact moment they were ready to strike the decisive blow, their engines would fall silent. That was the Soviet trick, and it changed the war. The roots of this strategy went back to June 22, 1941. At 3:15 in the morning, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. More than 3 million German and Axis soldiers crossed the border into the Soviet Union. Thousands of tanks surged east. Aircraft filled the sky. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded. In the first weeks, German commanders seemed unstoppable. Cities fell one after another. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. German officers spoke confidently of ending the campaign before winter. But there was a problem hidden beneath every victory: distance. The Soviet Union was vast beyond anything most German soldiers had imagined. Roads were poor, railways used a different gauge, bridges were scarce, dust choked engines in summer, and mud swallowed trucks in autumn. Every kilometer east placed more pressure on German supply columns. A Panzer III consumed fuel rapidly during cross-country movement. A Panzer IV, heavier and more powerful, demanded even more. Support vehicles multiplied the problem. Recovery tractors, half-tracks, fuel bowsers, and ammunition trucks all needed gasoline or diesel. To keep one armored division moving, supply officers had to deliver hundreds of tons of fuel, and those deliveries depended on trucks driving ever longer distances. By late 1941, Soviet commanders had begun to notice a pattern. German attacks were strongest at the beginning. Then they slowed. Then they stalled. Sometimes the tanks were still intact, but they simply stopped moving. This was not always because of combat losses. Often they were waiting for fuel. Among the officers studying this problem were men like General Georgy Zhukov, Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, and logistics planners deep within the Soviet General Staff. They understood that Germany's greatest tactical strength created a strategic vulnerability. German doctrine depended on speed. If speed could be turned against the Germans, their own success could become a trap. The first Soviet response was harsh and simple. Destroy what the enemy needed. When Soviet forces retreated, they burned fuel dumps, rail yards, warehouses, and grain stores. Bridges were demolished. Locomotives were evacuated or destroyed. Partisans were instructed to sabotage roads and rail lines. But by 1942, Soviet thinking became more sophisticated. Instead of only denying resources, they began shaping the German advance. This required patience. It meant abandoning ground. It meant allowing German commanders to believe they were forcing another collapse. The most dramatic example unfolded around Stalingrad. By the summer of 1942, Hitler launched Case Blue, a massive offensive aimed at the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. German forces advanced hundreds of miles. At first, the offensive seemed successful, but every mile increased the burden on supply. Fuel trains had to travel from Romania and occupied Europe to railheads far behind the front. Cargo was transferred to trucks. Trucks drove over rough roads, consuming part of the very fuel they carried. Sometimes, a truck burned nearly as much fuel delivering gasoline as the tanks at the front received. The farther the Germans advanced, the more inefficient the system became. Soviet commanders watched closely. They saw German armored units racing toward Stalingrad. They saw supply lines stretching across the Don Steppe. They saw flanks guarded not by elite German divisions, but by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian troops with fewer anti-tank weapons. And they recognized a perfect opportunity. The Soviet plan, later known as Operation Uranus, was approved in November 1942. The goal was not to smash head-on into the strongest German units fighting in Stalingrad. Instead, Soviet armies would strike the weaker flanks, surround the German Sixth Army, and cut off its supplies. But behind this famous encirclement was a deeper principle. The Germans had been drawn so far forward that their logistics were stretched to the limit. They were strongest at the front and weakest behind it. That imbalance was exactly what the Soviets wanted. On the morning of November 19, 1942, at 7:20 a.m., thousands of Soviet guns opened fire through snow and fog north of Stalingrad. The ground shook. Romanian positions collapsed. Soviet tank corps poured through the gaps. The next day, another assault struck from the south. On November 23, Soviet forces linked up near Kalach on Don. The trap closed. More than 250,000 Axis troops were surrounded. Inside the pocket were German tanks, assault guns, artillery, and vehicles. Many were still operational. But they were now dependent on a shrinking stock of fuel. Each attempt to move burned precious liters. Each defensive shift reduced what remained. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, requested permission to break out. A breakout required fuel, and fuel was exactly what he lacked. The Luftwaffe promised to supply the pocket by air. It failed. Aircraft delivered only a fraction of what was needed. Fuel became so scarce that many armored vehicles were abandoned where they stood. Crews drained every usable drop from damaged machines. Engines were started only when absolutely necessary. The Sixth Army had not been destroyed in a single dramatic armored battle. It had been lured forward, isolated, and starved. This was the Soviet trick at its most devastating. But Stalingrad was not the only example. The same logic appeared again and again. During the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the Germans prepared Operation Citadel, intending to pinch off a large Soviet salient. They assembled Panthers, Tigers, and Ferdinand tank destroyers. The force looked formidable. But Soviet intelligence had detected the plan. Instead of retreating in panic, the Red Army built multiple defensive belts, minefields, anti-tank positions, and reserve lines. The intention was not merely to stop the Germans. It was to force them to expend fuel, ammunition, and mechanical life before reaching the decisive zone. When German units attacked on July 5, they advanced slowly through deep defenses. Mines damaged tracks, engineers were forced to clear lanes, vehicles idled for hours, detours around wrecks consumed more gasoline. Dust and heat strained engines. By the time some German formations reached major engagements, such as Prokhorovka on July 12, they had already burned enormous amounts of fuel. Losses mattered. But so did exhaustion. Tanks that should have been charging forward were halted for repairs or waiting for refueling. When Soviet reserves counterattacked, German units were no longer fresh. Their offensive power had been drained before they reached the breakthrough. That was the same principle used at Stalingrad. Allow movement, increase consumption, strike when momentum dies. The Soviet trick worked because German armored warfare was designed around rapid, uninterrupted movement. A tank attack was like a sprint. If the sprint was extended too far, the runner collapsed. Soviet commanders exploited terrain to accelerate this collapse. In autumn, they used the Rasputitsa, the season of mud. Roads became rivers of thick clay. Trucks bogged down. Recovery vehicles burned more fuel, pulling them free. Detours lengthened routes. Entire convoys arrived late or not at all. In winter, extreme cold created new difficulties. Engines were kept running to prevent freezing. Starting a cold engine consumed fuel and strained batteries. Crews burned gasoline to heat equipment. All of this reduced reserves. In summer, dust clogged filters and reduced engine performance. The Soviet Union itself became part of the trap. Partisans added another layer. Operating behind German lines, Soviet partisans attacked railroads, bridges, and fuel depots. A single demolished track could delay trains for days. Fuel that should have reached the front remained stranded hundreds of kilometers away. German records repeatedly complained that supplies were late, incomplete, or diverted. Tank commanders at the front often had no idea why their fuel deliveries were shrinking. They only saw the gauges falling. The psychological effect was severe. Tank crews trusted their machines. They trusted their armor. But they could not fight the fuel needle. At first, commanders ignored it. Then, they became cautious. Then, desperate. Orders changed. Movement was restricted. Reconnaissance patrols were canceled.